Are you ready for a story that will sink its teeth into you and refuse to let go? Today, I bring you the intimate confession of Eleanor, a tale of forbidden attraction, a quiet life turned upside down, and a night that rewrote history. Prepare yourselves for a narrative charged with tension, where emotions run so close to the surface you can almost touch them. This is a story that demands you stay until the very last word. But before we dive into the deep end, if you appreciate true stories that explore the fragile boundaries of the human heart, we need your support. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes next. The silence in Eleanor and Harold's colonial-style home was not the peaceful kind found in empty churches or libraries. It was a structural silence, heavy and dense, like a wet wool blanket on a humid July night. At 68, Eleanor had memorized the house's unique lexicon, the specific groan of the third step on the staircase, the high-pitched whine of the pantry door, and the resigned, rhythmic sigh of her husband from the other side of the breakfast table. These were the sounds of a life built entirely on predictability. Their marriage was a fortress. But lately, Eleanor had begun to suspect that what was meant to keep the world out was actually keeping her locked in. The bars of this prison weren't made of iron, but of unshakable routine and a mute, distant affection. Harold, recently turned 70, was a man of rituals. He treated his morning routine with the solemnity of a religious liturgy. The Wall Street Journal folded in thirds, the black coffee brewed to a specific bitterness, and the meticulous, almost surgical care of his prize-winning orchids in the conservatory. Those flowers received a tenderness that Eleanor hadn't felt in years. He loved her. Eleanor knew this in the abstract way one knows the laws of physics, or that the Earth orbits the sun. It was a love that existed through inertia, a gravitational force keeping them in the same solar system, but devoid of heat. There was no combustion, no spark. Over the last decade, Eleanor had begun to feel less like a wife and more like a piece of antique furniture, sturdy, reliable, familiar, but ultimately invisible to the eye. That Thursday morning began like a carbon copy of the 1,000 Thursdays before it. Harold was submerged in the state of the economy, frowning at interest rates and ignoring the small, dying universe sitting across from him. Eleanor stood at the sink, washing the fine china, feeling the lukewarm water against hands that were beginning to map the passage of time, with sunspots and translucent skin. She caught her reflection in the polished chrome of the toaster. Who was that woman with the silver bob and the tired eyes? It was a face she barely recognized. It was the mask of a housewife, a grandmother, a good woman. It was not the face of the woman who still felt a fire burning in the pit of her stomach, a woman who remembered what it was to be voracious. Then, she saw him through the kitchen window. Julian, the new neighbor who had moved into the mid-century modern house next door 6 months ago. He was a widower, a retired professor of comparative literature from the city. He was the antithesis of the silence that suffocated Eleanor's home. His gestures were broad and animated. His smile came easily, unburdened by cynicism. And his eyes had the terrible, dangerous habit of actually seeing things. He saw her in the window. He didn't just wave casually. He stopped, offered a deliberate salute, a gesture of recognition. Eleanor felt her heart stumble in her chest, a lazy muscle forced into a sprint it hadn't trained for. She dried her hands on her floral apron, and moved by an impulse she couldn't quite name, or perhaps refused to name, she walked out into the backyard. The pretext was pruning the hydrangeas, but the truth was she was moth drawn to a flame. Harold didn't even lift his head from the newspaper. To him, the sound of the back door was just background noise, a gear turning in the immutable machine of his day. His indifference was like a permission slip, a door left ajar leading to a dark, tempting corridor. Julian approached the low picket fence that divided their properties. He didn't talk about the weather, or the homeowners' association fees, or the pests eating the leaves. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a rich baritone that seemed to wrap around the syllables. "I was just reading Byron, and the color of your roses. It reminded me of a line. She walks in beauty, like the night. They have a certain tenacity, don't they? Just like you." The way he said her name was different. It wasn't the functional Eleanor that Harold used to ask for the salt or inquire about his dry cleaning. It was a name with texture, with weight. Eleanor felt a flush rise up her neck, a teenage reaction in a body nearing 70. It felt ridiculous, yet utterly miraculous. She remembered when Harold used to look at her like that, like she was a riddle he wanted to solve. She remembered hands seeking hers under dinner tables, the electric tension of a silence that was pregnant with desire, not emptiness. Standing there with Julian, talking about poetry and roses, was a painful, thrilling echo of that past. He made her remember not just what she had lost, but who she had forgotten. She was. When Harold finally stood up, announcing he was leaving for his weekly bridge club at the community center, Eleanor felt a tidal wave of relief, followed by a sharp undertow of guilt. The house, usually a cavern of loneliness when he left, suddenly transformed into a landscape of possibility. Harold's sedan turned the corner, and the silence that followed changed frequency. It was no longer heavy. It was vibrant. It was the silence of held breath. The phone rang 10 minutes later. The caller ID flashed, Julian. Her heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that made her lightheaded. "Forgive the boldness," Julian said, his voice crackling with a static that felt intimate. "But I've just brewed a pot of Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee, and I wondered if you might accept a cup. Perhaps you'd like to see that first edition of The Great Gatsby I mentioned the other day. It was an excuse so fragile, so transparent, that it was almost insulting to pretend otherwise. It wasn't about coffee. It wasn't about F. Scott Fitzgerald." Eleanor hesitated for a moment that stretched into an eternity. The image of Harold, of 44 years of marriage, of the children, the grandchildren, the Sunday roasts, the Christmas cards. It all flashed through her mind like a film on fast forward. That was her life. That was the story she had written. But Julian's voice promised a new chapter. Maybe just a footnote, maybe an epilogue, but something that would be hers and hers alone. "I would be delighted," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, younger, breathless. Before leaving, she stood before the hallway mirror. She stripped off the gardening clothes and changed into a blouse of deep cerulean silk she hadn't worn in years. She applied a coat of lipstick, a shade called Wild Berry, a gesture that felt almost archaeological, digging up a relic of her former self. The woman in the mirror still had tired eyes, but now there was a spark in them, a glimmer of conspiracy. She wasn't just about to betray her husband. She was about to meet herself. Julian's house was the polar opposite of hers. If Eleanor's home was a museum of memories preserved in amber, Julian's was a celebration of the chaotic present. Books were stacked in precarious towers in every corner. Soft, complex jazz, perhaps Bill Evans, drifted from a vintage turntable. The air smelled of fresh coffee, old paper, and beeswax. It was a space that breathed. He was waiting for her in the living room. The look he gave her when she entered was worth every second of her hesitation. He didn't look at her like Harold's wife. He didn't look at her like the nice neighbor lady. He looked at her the way one looks at a masterpiece in a gallery, with admiration, curiosity, and a restrained hunger. He took her hand to greet her. His grip was firm, warm, and dry. He didn't let go immediately. That extra second of contact was a declaration, a contract signed without ink. They sat in leather, armchairs facing each other, the coffee steaming on a low table between them. The conversation flowed without the friction of routine. They moved from literature to travel destinations never visited, from abandoned dreams to the peculiar small joys of aging. Eleanor found herself confessing things she had never told Harold, not for lack of love, but for lack of language. With Harold, conversation was logistical. With Julian, it was existential. He listened with an intensity that felt physical. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, absorbing her words. Eleanor felt as though she were unfolding, layer by layer, revealing the vibrant, intelligent woman who had been hibernating beneath the winter of her marriage. With every confession, she felt lighter, more dangerous, more alive. The coffee gave way to a bottle of rich, heavy Cabernet. The wine warmed her chest, loosening the last of her inhibitions. Julian stood up and flipped the record. A slow, melancholic melody filled the room. "Do you remember this?" he asked. It was a standard from their youth, a song that smelled of smoke-filled ballrooms and corsages. He extended his hand. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Eleanor stood, the wine humming in her veins, and took his hand. In the center of the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of fictional characters and the jazz of a bygone era, they began to dance. It was a slow movement, tentative at first, like two countries negotiating a peace treaty, but soon they found a shared rhythm. His hand on the small of her back was firm, protective, yet possessive. Her hand on his shoulder felt the strength of a body that, while marked by time, was still capable. The distance between them evaporated with every measure of the music. The scent of him, a mixture of sandalwood soap, old books, and the wine, intoxicated her more than the alcohol ever could. She rested her head on his chest and closed her eyes. She could hear the steady thrum of his heart, a strong, rhythmic drumbeat that contrasted with the hurricane raging inside her. There was no guilt in that moment, only the raw truth of two bodies, two souls meeting in the autumn of their lives, starving for a warmth they thought had been extinguished by the cold wind of age. The music faded, the needle scratching softly in the run-out groove, but they did not part. The silence that settled in the room was electric. It was heavy with questions and answers. Julian reached up and tucked a loose strand of silver hair behind her ear. The brush of his fingertips against her skin sent a shiver cascading down her spine. His gaze dropped to her mouth. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Eleanor held her breath. She knew what was coming. She wanted it with an urgency that shocked her. She wanted the seal of this treason. She wanted confirmation that she was still a creature of flesh and blood, capable of inspiring passion, capable of making a magnificent mistake. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the frantic, sloppy kissing of teenagers. It was a kiss of profound recognition. It tasted of wine, of melancholy, of decades of unexpressed longing. His lips were soft but demanding. They awakened nerve endings Eleanor had declared dead 20 years ago. She responded with equal intensity, her hands rising to cup his face, fingers tangling in his thick salt and pepper hair. It was a kiss that said everything words could not. It spoke of loneliness, of rediscovery, of fear, and of surrender. The outside world, Harold, the bridge club, the mortgage, the grandchildren, ceased to exist. There was only this room, this man, and this fire. When they pulled apart, breathless, the path forward was clear. He took her hand again, interlacing their fingers, and led her toward the stairs. Every step up was a step further away from her old life, and closer to a delicious abyss. The bedroom was simple, bathed in the golden, forgiving light of the late afternoon sun. He turned her around, and began to undo the buttons of the blue silk blouse. His fingers were expert, yet she felt a slight tremor in them that betrayed his own emotion. Eleanor watched his face as he undressed her. There was reverence in his eyes. He made her feel precious. She wasn't a body to be conquered. She was a secret to be revealed, and she allowed herself to be revealed. Skin against skin. The shock of it, his body, wrinkled in places, scarred in others, told the story of a life lived, and hers answered. A map of stretch marks, of gravity, of time. There was no shame here, only a radical acceptance. The act itself was not an explosion of fury, but a reunion, a dialogue of bodies that understood the language of need. It was slow, deep, and devastatingly intimate. Eleanor felt a wave of pleasure that began in her toes and flooded her mind, washing away the gray dust of her routine. The sounds that escaped her throat belonged to a stranger, a wilder, freer woman. For Eleanor, this wasn't just sex. It was an insurrection. It was a rebellion against invisibility. Every touch from Julian was an affirmation. I see you. I want you. You exist. Afterward, they lay in silence, limbs tangled in the disarray of the sheets. The sun had set, and the room was painted in twilight shadows. Eleanor listened to his breathing, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against her cheek. The silence was now one of complicity. It was heavy with the weight of what they had done, but buoyant with the freedom they had stolen. Getting dressed was a solemn affair. Putting her clothes back on felt like donning a costume. The silk blouse, now wrinkled, felt like a disguise. When she looked in his bedroom mirror, she saw the same woman, but her eyes held a secret. There was a depth there that hadn't been there at breakfast, a shadow of knowledge and sin. The goodbye at the door was brief, a final, chaste kiss to seal the pact. No promises were made, no plans were drawn up. They both possessed the wisdom to Know that what had happened was a singular event, an anomaly in time. To try and replicate it might vulgarize its perfection. Whatever came next belonged to another day. Walking the 60 feet back to her front door, Eleanor felt the ground unsteady beneath her shoes. The evening air was crisp, and she inhaled deeply, trying to clear her head, but the scent of Julian seemed woven into her skin. She entered her silent house. The lights were off. Harold wasn't back yet. The house was exactly as she had left it, a sanctuary of order, but everything had changed because she had changed. She touched the dining table, the chair where Harold sat, the framed photos of the grandkids. They looked like artifacts from a civilization she no longer fully belonged to. She went upstairs and took a long, hot shower, scrubbing her skin as if trying to wash away the evidence, or perhaps trying to scrub the memory deeper into her pores. There was no regret. There was a strange calm, a sensation of power. The secret she now carried was a burden, yes, but it was also an anchor. It was something that was purely hers. When she heard the garage door rumble open, her heart didn't race with panic. It beat with a cold, steady rhythm. Harold entered, tired from his game, and greeted her with the same dry peck on the cheek he had given her for 30 years. He didn't notice the flush in her cheeks. He didn't notice the tension in her shoulders. He didn't smell the soap that wasn't hers. He noticed, nothing. That night, lying in bed next to her husband's sleeping form, Eleanor stared at the ceiling in the dark. The rhythmic sound of Harold's breathing, once a comfort, now sounded like a countdown. Guilt was there, a cold ember in her stomach, but sitting right next to the guilt was something stronger. The vivid memory of the touch, the kiss, the feeling of being fully seen. It was a warm flame that kept the cold away. She had crossed a line, and she knew there was no return ticket. The question floating in the dark wasn't, "Why did I do this?" The question was, "And now what?" Friday dawn arrived with a poetic cruelty. The sunlight slicing through the blinds wasn't just a new day. It was a spotlight on Eleanor's secret. She watched the dust motes dance in the light and looked at the floral wallpaper she had stared at for decades. It suddenly looked fake, like a flimsy set design for a play she no longer wanted to star in. Beside her, Harold snored, a slumbering continent she had lost the desire to explore. Getting out of bed felt like leaving the scene of a crime. Her body felt different. Her muscles ached with a sweet soreness, the pain of atrophy being reversed. In the kitchen, breakfast was a theater of the absurd. Harold sat in his spot. He opened his paper. He complained about the government. Eleanor poured the coffee, and the aroma, usually comforting, just smelled like morning. She felt like a spy in her own life. "Gutters need cleaning," Harold mumbled, not looking up. Julian's sheets were cotton, Eleanor thought. "Price of tomatoes is up again," Harold noted. The wine tasted like blackberries, Eleanor remembered. It was a complete dissociation. Her body performed the duties of a wife, while her soul was still across the street. Suddenly, Harold looked up. He stared right at her. For a second of sheer terror, Eleanor thought he knew. She thought her sin was branded on her forehead. "Coffee's good today," he said simply, then went back to the sports section. His indifference, which had been her source of pain for so long, was now her shield. Later, while watering the roses, the accomplices to her crime, she saw him. Julian came out to get his mail. The world stopped. The air between the two lawns grew dense. This was the test. He walked to the fence. He didn't smile immediately. He just looked at her, and in that look was a universe of shared knowledge. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said. The banality of the phrase was excruciating. It was so normal, yet so heavy. "Good morning, Julian," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Your azaleas are looking bright." "Yes," he said, his eyes softening. "They bloomed overnight." It was a code. Azaleas meant yesterday. Good morning meant I haven't forgotten. He turned back to his house, and that was enough. The rest of the day, Eleanor moved through the world like a sleepwalker. A call from her daughter about the kids sounded like a broadcast from a distant planet. She answered correctly, made the right grandmotherly noises, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself in the attic, opening an old wooden box she hadn't touched in 20 years. Inside were dried-up tubes of oil paint and stiff brushes. She touched the bristles, She remembered the girl who wanted to paint landscapes. That girl had dissolved into the wife, the mother, the grandmother. Julian hadn't just awakened her body. He had exhumed her spirit. She looked at Harold that evening with a new perspective. The resentment was gone, replaced by a strange pity. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who was also lost. A man who had traded passion for safety so long ago he forgot the difference. Perhaps her betrayal was against the silent pact they had both made to sleepwalk through death. That night, after dinner, while Harold dozed in his armchair, Eleanor felt a cold determination crystallize in her chest. She didn't know if she would sleep with Julian again. She didn't know if her marriage would survive. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she could not go back to being the furniture. She pulled a book of poetry from the shelf. She read a verse about the ocean, about tides that destroy and create. The secret was now part of her internal landscape. It was a place she could go when the silence got too loud. It was dangerous. It was wrong, but it was hers. Lying in bed that night, she looked out the window at the dark silhouette of Julian's house. The question in her mind had evolved. It was no longer, what will I do? It was deeper. Who will I choose to be? And for the first time in forever, the answer didn't depend on anyone but her. If this story touched a nerve, if you felt Eleanor's heartbeat in your own chest, don't leave without giving us a like. It helps us bring more of these hidden truths to light. Subscribe to the channel and join our community of storytellers and listeners. And tell me in the comments, was Eleanor wrong? Or was she simply surviving? I want to know what you think. See you in the next story.